I was part of a group of seekers starting back in 1975 that were interested in the esoteric tradition, but we didn't have a lot of direction at that time. Fortunately, I met a teacher, an Oriental gentleman who was about 15 years older than me, that had awakened when he was about 15 or 16, meditating in Indonesia at a temple called Borobudur, which has been restored and is very famous. But he eventually emigrated. I live in Canada, in Toronto, and he had a very good grasp of the esoteric tradition. But he used charts, very colorful charts, explaining the different planes, physical, astral, lower, higher mental, Buddhic, etc., showing both not only 7 rays, but the different bodies, your physical, etheric body, to the Kamarupa or astral body, to the causal body, and Buddhic body, etc. They don't have the facilities here for charts, but there are a number of the charts in my book. These charts take esoteric teaching and compress it into a 2-dimensional systemic symbolism. That, for instance, one of the deeper teachings in India that's given out, there are 4 vidyas, or 4 great knowledges. One is called Atma Vidya. If you read Blavatsky in her collective writings, she mentions that Theosophy is all Atma Vidya. Atma meaning the one self, Vidya, radiant or esoteric knowledge. Atma Vidya is the key to self-understanding. But that was the basis of the teaching that my teacher gave out. But we were not an intellectual group. We were a group that practiced, intense practicing. But before, from 1975 to 1978, we experimented with many things. Even though he, in profession, was a scientist or a chemist, so he had a very strong pragmatic mind and had a very good grasp of the esoteric tradition, but he understood or sensed the mysteries, the divine mysteries. And he had experienced some many unusual things growing up. So he had the mystical, occult side and this aspect. If you understand what's called the 7 rays, he was very 5th ray, very highly organized, systematic, and very logical. No fancy, no nonsense. You know, he always helped with the students to cut through. We tend to want to dream about, the higher planes, and we have an experience, no, that's lower astral, or this is this. He knew exactly. So we practice. We practice with different mantrams like Gayatri mantram, Shiva mantram. We did all different kinds of physical exercises with meditation. But that was all, how would you call it, experimenting. So the book goes into what the group was doing, but what I did. So for instance, in 1977, I went to India, my first trip. I was about 30 years old, and I had decided to go to Palgam and to go on a hike up to Amarnath, which has a lingam but made out of ice. On the full moon in August, it supposedly glows, but it's really crowded and people fall off of cliffs going up there. It's a couple of days journey hiking up. I went the month before. But I was focusing on Shiva mantram at the time and visualizing this lingam, because I'm going to go to where this natural lingam is. But as I'm walking and meditating, concentrating, sounding Om Namo Shivaya, Shivaya, all of a sudden the lingam explodes in my heart, and out comes Avalokiteshvara. I don't know if you know Avalokiteshvara. Tibetans call it Chenrezig, a Buddhist deity related to the flame of the Logos, or from the Tibetan side is the Lord of Love and Compassion. Well, that put me into a lot of confusion. Should I be Buddhist? Am I chanting on the Hindu path, esoteric path? So it just gives you an idea of some of the things that went on. Later in that trip, my teacher had told me to go to a place called Balurmath, which is just outside of Calcutta, where Vivekananda and Brahmananda meditated and set up a temple in honor of Ramakrishna. I had read most of all of Ramakrishna's stuff, so I thought I'd go there, and my teacher said, stay there. It's a big facility. They got rooms. He was able to stay there, but he says, you're white. It might be a little harder. The monks there are a little bit difficult to deal with. He had some problems, but he stayed there. So I went there and told them that I wanted to stay. And they said, no, you can't. Well, why not? You know, I've studied Ramakrishna, I meditate, I'm pure vegetarian, nope, you can't stay there. No reason, just no. And the monks, or the swamis, because they're all in swami robes, seem very, how would you say, very close-minded. They just, central office, I sat down and started meditating. And they, oh, please move, please. I did not move, didn't open my eyes, didn't move. And they started running around. This is my book, so I'm giving a little idea. And they didn't know what to do. So they called the manager, a head swami came. He bent down and he said, excuse me, sir, why don't you come with me into the office? Tell me what you want. Well, this sounds good. Stop meditating, go with him. I sit in his office. He has couches, nice office. What do you want? I want to stay here the night, and I want to pray to Ramakrishna and meditate here. No, you can't. Not possible. Why not? You can't. No reason. You just almost felt discriminated against. So I just started meditating and wouldn't move. He got really upset. And he ran out. A little while later, he came back. I went and saw the head swami of the whole facility. He will see you. Please come with me. So we start walking, and this is a very large compound of big temples, dormitories, buildings, and beautiful, beautiful gardens, and the Ganges River there. It's large. And we're walking. Finally, we pass through these buildings, and there's a big swami, big fella, sitting behind this huge desk, sitting outside working, and my intuition, oh, that's got to be him. But we just walk right by. So he puts me on a bench overlooking the Ganges, says, you wait here. Fine, start meditating again. I'm meditating. It's been quite some time. I feel a tap on my knee. I look up. There's a very young swami, nice fella. He has a plate of food, Indian food. Are you hungry? Sure. Stop meditating, have a beautiful meal, water, finishing, start meditating. I'm just continuing meditating, and there's no indications from anything. But at some point in that meditation, because of the, how do you call it, the intention, I put myself under duress, under being uncomfortable, because I'm a very easygoing person. I like to do things nicely, but not to create an international incident, which turned out a little later. Anyway, because of that and the focus of my meditation, I went into samadhi. I went to where I left my body as consciousness. And in that samadhi, I was told, but through mental telepathy, which is very interesting because you're only a point of conscious awareness, a point of high awareness, no body, no real thought, but totally centered in being. I'm a Buddhist. I was told, as Buddhist, told which deity I'm connected to, everything. Came down and back to my physical body, still meditating, thinking, wow, this is a lot to think about, because the path of my teacher and everything, and all of a sudden I'm going, it's going to create quite a difference. So I'm meditating further on this. Then there's a knock. I was sitting on a bench in this area, and there's a little sidewall knock, and I look up, and there's a policeman, but dressed in full regatta, medals, everything. He said, excuse me, he says, I hope you don't mind. He was very polite, but I'm the chief of police for this whole area. Do you mind if we talk? I said, no. He says, what do you want? I want to stay here. He says, well, I don't know if that's possible. I said, well, give me a few minutes. I want to meditate a bit more. So he took a walk. There's a ghat. A ghat is where you walk down to bathe in the river or to sit. And I go meditate for a while, and then I realize my purpose has been accomplished. I open my eyes, and I can see a little bit of smoke coming out from the ghat, and I know he's smoking. I go and sit with them. And I said, I will leave if you do me a favor. Will you get me on a first-class train to Chennai? And he has a walkie-talkie. There were no cell phones back there, but, but military walkie-talkie. Starts talking it. It's arranged. Go with him. He has a Jeep there. Zoom to the station. There's a big, he's called him Lieutenant when I met, had my ticket, so both me and the lieutenant get on board the train. So I say to this gentleman as he's sitting across from me in the first class compartment, are you going to Chennai too? No, I'm just here to make sure you don't get off the train. My mind and heart had been set that I had to change my path. When I came back to Toronto, I had to explain all this to my teacher, who has a deep respect and had undergone an initiation when he was in India in 1974 at Arunachala and had received something from Lord Shiva. It's a whole other story. And so we slowly had to change him. But in the meantime, one day I came home from work. I was an arts and film teacher when I'm not traveling, and I came home, and we rented this huge house. We had a meeting meditation room, we had an upstairs meditation room, and several people in this very large old brownstone. And he was talking with this Indian gentleman, so I wanted to sit down and join them, but he told me to go meditate. So instead of chatting, I went upstairs to the upstairs meditation, and I sat down to meditate. This is now 1978 from 77. When I was in India, 78. It's only a year later. As I sat down, this force entered through me. I was like as if paralyzed, being charged through my chakras. Then I recognized it was from one of the Theosophical masters who was listed there. And in the book, it mentions it's the Master R. It's known as the Master Rakasi. Anyways, meditation's finished. I feel free and highly charged. I go downstairs. The Indian gentleman had left. My teacher says, how's your meditation? Well, I hardly could meditate. I felt the Master Rakasi and this force. And he says, well, we don't have anything to do with the Master Rakasi. And he sort of brushed it off. Oh, okay. 3 weeks later, my teacher and his wife and daughter were going to Virginia Beach. It's a 2-day drive from Toronto down to, that's where Edgar Cayce has a center, if you've ever read. Anyways, one night they stopped in Baltimore to go further. He has a dream. The Master Rakasi comes and gives him a word of power, which sort of verified my thing. But if it's given by a master, it instantly connects you to that master and to the ashram of which he represents. Connects you inwardly, naturally. So there's a whole story involved with that, but my teacher went to Virginia Beach, came home, and told us the story and tried to teach us this mantra. An esoteric mantra can only be properly chanted when you can center in alignment with your soul. The mantra cannot be chanted with your personality. Your personality is the one that wants to make progress, wants to do this, that. It can only be chanted when you can center in your essential nature in the what's called the soul in incarnation, a very esoteric idea, and you cannot find it in hardly any books. is the soul is dual. There's the soul on the high plane, higher mental plane, the second or third subplane, and the soul within the heart of the individual. It's a reflection of the soul, but it's covered, heavily covered by the personality, to make it simple. He had a hard time trying, because he was naturally in his essential nature. He had awakened there and he could chant it. But still, he longed for Shiva. He had still attachments to the Shiva, and he didn't know, even though the Master Rakasi had given him this mantra, and that it was very unusual to chant because of the notes. But he was trying to teach it. It took me 2 years before I could really chant this mantra. But to help convince him, one night my teacher has a dream. In the dream, he's meditating in front of a Tibetan tanka. And from this tanka, 3 lamas come out. The first one chants the mantra that was given to us by the Master Rakasi, and explains that this is very esoteric for the path of initiation, but is considered the lower of the esoteric. The next one chants and said this is for high initiates and masters. The next Lama chants and said this is for the level of the logos. It's specially chanted, special tune, disappears. But when my teacher wakes up, he is convinced and he's able to let go of Shiva. But he couldn't remember the other 2 tunes because they are so esoteric and way above him. But so that giving of that mantra, and as a small group of people, we started chanting it regularly. And as you awaken, you start to feel that there's something special about it. He was having experiences, but one day we're chanting in our downstairs meditation room, and the doorbell goes. And he motions to me, there's only about 7 or 8 of us, to go see who's at the door. I go. But they're still chanting. When I come back in, I could feel as if I was entering through a seal. Like there was something there, like a whirling fire, the Kona fire. That was, if you read in the Letters on Occult Meditation by the Tibetan Master D.K. through Alice Bailey, he talks about group chanting creating a funnel from the higher plane to the lower that's like a funnel, which is a triangle. And that's what I felt that I was actually entering. And then we were given this esoteric mantra, but I felt like we were guinea pigs, thrown this esoteric tidbit, but from that evolved a teaching. And in the advertisement at the Watkins bookstore, it said, the next step forward. We started to develop a synthesized teaching based on the esoteric tradition, not changing the rules, but simplifying, taking esoteric, or they call it esoteric Hinduism, the Sanatana Dharma, blending Vajrayana Buddhism with Gurdjieff and Yoga Vidya, or the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And we would take the essence of each. For instance, in the Yoga Sutras, there are 4 books. There are many sutras, but there is a deep psychology related to the modifications of the mind stuff, or citta, called the vrittis. There are 5 vrittis. But if you look at the translation of the 5 vrittis, very hard to understand. For instance, viparyarya, which is the first related to tamas guna, related to the slow motion of matter or inertia. But how does that relate to one psychologically? So through our inspiration, we start to realize that this related to, like, if a person's in depression. When you become in depression, you can't move out of it. It's very hard. That means the vritti of viparyarya is like quicksand, like sucks you in. So he had to understand the motion of these vrittis related to modern psychology. And that brought it to life. Then we added the Gurdjieff teaching, and he talks not about 5 vrittis, but 5 centers. You have a thinking, intellectual center, an emotional center, which is the basis of what most people have, but he talks about a mysterious one called the movement center. So for instance, if your movement center is very good, then you could be very good, say, at martial arts or gymnastics or ballet or a sports person. But if your movement center, if there's something out of whack with it, then you have difficulties, sort of like, for a joke, Howard Wolowitz in The Big Bang Theory trying to throw a baseball or something. The movement center doesn't function. But then the other aspect is it causes the thoughts to constantly move. It also relates to the heart beating, the blood circulating. So then we mix that with the vritti, then you start to get a deeper understanding of your own psychology in order to look at oneself, to apply Atma Vidya. Who am I? Or Atma Vichara, as Sri Ramana Maharishi used to say, who am I? And so our knowledge of self started to become expanded, going deeper into our own being. Thus, our past lives started to waken up. People started to experience, not going for past life regression, but recognizing in yourself what you did in the past that has to be worked on. So one of the interesting statements my teacher made, in order to attain liberation, you have to learn to incarnate in the past. What does that mean? It's a very esoteric phrase, meaning that you have to be able to go into your past lives, see the negative qualities there, and transform them through the use, and then we understood the use of this mantra. It burns the negative, what they call kamarupas. Okay, Madame Blavatsky talked about kamarupa, but only relative to this life, related to your kama desire, the forms of your desire. Oh, I want a big house, I want a car. That's little, but if you have esoteric or occult kamarupa, that's a whole different thing. But what about the kamarupas in one past life? 2, 3, 4, going back. They accumulate. And the accumulation of this is what they call esoterically the dweller on the threshold, that all aspirants have to face. And that only happens when you start to awaken your center of awareness and awaken and separate from the personality, from your different thoughts, your emotions, and you reach a certain stage, and then there's another separation. If you read, like in books of Zanoni, it gives hints about this separation. Then you have the dweller on the threshold, or sometimes called the iron bar, that has to be lifted by the neophyte in order to enter into the mystery. Our group started to have the experiences of the dweller on the threshold. For instance, one of our fellow members was, how would you say, he was a yoga teacher. Professionally, he was a lawyer, but been vegetarian for so long. He helped people. He was very free with his money. He earned a very large income compared to a teacher like myself. But then all of a sudden, from his past life, it came out, and I write about this, and it becomes part of the ordeal that went on for over 8 years. He was a black magician, but he had the Kama Rupa. And then somehow the master combined his mind with my teacher's mind. No matter what happened to him, my teacher knew it instantly, no matter where he was. Eventually, he had to stop working because this force of this is very esoteric, I don't know, I do mention a bit of it, but the force of his past could draw, call it his occult magician buddies from the past that still exist on the lower, on the astral planes, and they would come and they would attack my teacher. And my teacher, and learning about how the different uses of what they call, if you read something like the Ramayana, and how Rama uses his bow and arrows, they're called astras, but they're charged with mantra. How that exists on the inner plane, my teacher discovered, and could do the same thing using different weapons to break down. And that lasted for 8 years, 4 years of which I had to help him. I had a full-time job starting at 8:30 till 4:30, but I would have to go to this man's house at about 9 o'clock. So I'd come home from work, have a quick bite, and sleep. I'd get a phone call, get in my car, drive to his house, and I would stay till 4 in the morning to make sure he didn't fall asleep. Because when he fell asleep and blacked out during the night versus the day, these negative forces would impact him immediately, my teacher, because they were as one. This is very occult initiation. And I had to keep him up. Then I'd come 4 o'clock, I'd go home, try and sleep an hour, hour and a half, eat, and go to work. 4 years sleeping for an hour and a half here, an hour and a half. But I'm charged by the mantram. Rarely would get tired because my being was held up by the forces of the inner ashram and my teacher's power. So that lasted for 4 years until that was broken and that disciple was liberated from all this past. So that's incarnating in the past. But my teacher underwent initiation, occult initiation. And after that, he started to develop cities that he was looking to develop. He had wanted to build an occult school, a preparatory school for students to come. He could teach the esoteric tradition, deeper meditation, etc. But the master said, no, that's not for you. And he ended up having to deal on the inner planes, breaking down negative forces, changing, call it the environment of the astral plane for whether it's the planet or a whole area, it's hard to tell. He passed away a little while ago, and my work has continued and still connected with not only the Master Rakasi, but 2 other masters since then. Actually, I mentioned one in the book. Been to Tibet and China, and I've even found esoteric places here in London that have existed for a long time that are still vibrant, which is very unusual. I was very surprised. The only one that I know of, and I'm very quite amazed, I was very surprised. Last year, I was in Egypt. My wife and I, we were in Egypt, and I've never had a very strong longing, even though I see a little bit of Egyptian down here. But we were very surprised, for instance, and then I'll relate the story, that Karnak, Temple of Karnak, much of it's in ruins. It's magnificent. I talk about it in my second book, which has not been published yet. Anyways, but you'd be walking in Karnak, and then all of a sudden it's like you pass through something, and there's an area that's still alive. There's still something left over. Must have been a ritual been done there. There's still forces that are still there. So we had been in Egypt and gone through many of the antiquities there, having some unusual experiences, especially in the Valley of the Kings. There are lots of both the good and not so good alive there. My wife was how I experienced the other side. But so we came to London because I had some speaking engagements after Egypt, and somehow I'm reading that Cleopatra's Needle was moved in 1870 to London. Well, we had a hop-on, hop-off bus that included boat tour, and we're on the Thames. I was going to say the Ganges. I always think of India. On the Thames, and oh, look, there's Cleopatra's Needle. But I could feel from a power coming out of it. I don't know if that's because we just returned from Egypt, and Egypt was in our blood, so to speak. We had so many experiences there. I'm more Tibetan, a lot of Tibetan incarnations and Indian incarnations. And certain, I even know the places in India that I've lived in my past lives and the different teachings. So we went to Cleopatra's Needle, but we're on a, how would you call it, a short stay here because we're traveling. And so we got there at night. And you can't really see it. Even they got little lights there and stuff. And it felt very interesting. But the next day I could tell the changes that occurred in my chitta, in the space, what they call chitta kasha, or the space of the mind. Mind stuff. Chitta is a Sanskrit word, and in the Yoga Sutras, it's Yoga Vritti Chitta Naroda. Okay, is the main sutra of which everything comes from. The chitta is the mind stuff. We in Western psychology, and until you awaken, don't know that the mind has different qualities of substance. And as liberation, when you think, people say, oh, I want to be liberated from worrying and heartache and pain. No, you're liberating yourself from the different qualities of substance, rarefying them so you can enter the higher planes. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the whole key of the Yoga Sutras. Because whoever Patanjali was, he was a great master. Probably what the Tibetans called a chohan, or a lord. He's not an ordinary human being. So I could tell in my chitta that there were changes had occurred since I visited the Cleopatra's Needle. But this whole area is just, we were just walking our hotels by the Globe Theater, and we could feel things walking by the Globe Theater. But my wife is very, very psychic. She's right there.
Hiding in the back.
She sees all sorts of things. But any other questions?
How did you meet your teacher?
That's a very simple teacher. I was looking, it's in the book, and it would be end of 1974-75, and I had this urge. I was at a party, and somebody mentioned the word ashram. What's an ashram? No, but somehow that word meant, I started asking that person. And then I met another person and said, would you be interested in taking a yoga class? Oh, what's yoga? Okay. She was very attractive at the time, and I was young, and I went with her. Started doing yoga. So I started doing yoga, I started to have experiences. Didn't realize later till it was the lower astral plane. And so I started to search a bit, and I read a book by Yogi Rama Sharaka, who I thought was some Indian yogi. I found out later that he's Western and changed his name. But he talked about a certain type of meditation. I started meditating a little bit here and there. Then I was invited to a yoga weekend. And there was this traveling Swami. And he had come back, he'd been going through North America and somehow knew somebody and came for one day. Then he was flying to India. Big Swami, usually they're skinny and stuff, but this gentleman was quite interesting. So there was a lot of people who were doing Hatha Yoga. And he was invited to give a little talk, which he did, and he told them, he said, Hatha Yoga is a waste of time. Very much upset a lot of people, including the Hatha Yoga teacher. He asked if anybody wanted to meditate. Out of maybe 50 people, only 5 of us went and meditated. Somehow, this yogi had siddhis. He could hear him inside me telling me how to visualize, and a mandala appeared. I don't want to go into that, But that lasted for a while in me. So then I started to search when I was home. And I went to a variety of places. And one day a friend of mine said, I know you're looking, and gave me, they were in a whole earth health food store. There was a little sign that said, those interested in esoteric tradition, call this number. That's it. So I called, and an Indian gentleman picked up and asked me if I had heard of Theosophy. I said, no. Have you ever read Alice A. Bailey? No. Oh, okay. And he said, and he took my phone number, and he hung up on me. Didn't say goodbye or anything. Next day, another gentleman called with a thick Oriental accent. Asked me the same questions. Have you ever been to the Theosophical Society? No. Have you read Alice A. Bailey, especially Letters on Occult Medicine? No. Huh. Well, I have this small course at the Theosophical Society every Thursday. If you want to come, here's the address. It's at 7:30. Come. He hung up. Came there, and there was this Oriental gentleman. He always wore a suit and tie, three-piece, like with a vest, and his wife, and he had this chart, and at the bottom was written Atma Vidya. As soon as he started explaining that, I felt this rush, even though he wasn't saying I'm a teacher or I'm anything, but I knew right then and there that he was going to be my teacher. So we met every week for a few weeks, and then I had booked, I was a teacher, so I had summers off, but I had booked a trip with a buddy of mine to go to California. Went to California, came back, wanted to go back into his class. He said, no, you disappeared, you're out. He was not a simple man. Fortunately, I had met a few people in the group, and one of them sponsored me, so and said, oh, he'll be good, this and that. Eventually I got invited back in. So, and then the group left the Theosophical Society, and we became very close. That's how I met my teacher. He was, how would you say, his amount of knowledge was mind-boggling. We eventually studied Sanskrit. We met an Indian that was part of the Sanskrit department at the University of Toronto, but he had got let go because there was a fight between him and the Scottish director that was anti-Indian. It was a terrible situation. And yet this man had written books on Sanskrit, and he was the personal translator for the Karmapa, the last one that died in 1980-something. And he had come over to Canada, and he started teaching us Sanskrit. For instance, to give you an idea of his depth, there's the word Krishna, Lord Krishna or Krishna. Krishna can mean black, can mean, to most people, just Lord Krishna. But he said, no, it's power. It's radiant power that radiates out, but then pulls you into the heart. So he started to teach us the deeper meaning of Sanskrit words. You know, our Ishta Devata, the deity that we were directed towards, is Avalokiteshvara. Ishvara means Lord. Avalokita means the Lord that comes down. So he explained, if you look at the statues of Avalokiteshvara with 11 heads and so many arms, he's standing. The top head is Amitabha, that represents boundless infinite light, or the unmanifest. But through manifestation, he comes down, he's standing on the earth. So he manifests from the highest, comes down to earth. So he's that which is in the heart of all life. It's a spark. If you ask the Tibetan lamas, oh, Avalokiteshvara or Chenrezig, oh, Lord of Love and Compassion. Well, what does it really mean? Well, just Lord of Love and Compassion, feel good, feel happy. But no, Avalokiteshvara, the depth of the explanation, then you get into understanding, then you apply that in your meditation, what each arm means, what each head means. There's a whole esoteric book there. One of the old Theosophists, I don't know if you've ever heard, his name was Subaru. He helped Madame Blavatsky check the secret doctrine. He was more advanced, actually. But being a Brahman, he was somewhat against the giving out of this teaching. But he mentions that Avalokiteshvara is the Ishtadevata of the Trans-Himalayan Brotherhood, of the Masters. And we realize we were an expression, an experiment from these Tibetan masters, Master Kudhumi, Master Cage, Master Rakasi Serapis, part of an experiment coming on the physical plane to see what happened with a bunch of, Western individuals, Caucasians, getting this very high energy, what would happen. One interesting story, if there's no more questions?
Yeah.
Yes, sure.
Are you a super psychic?
I'm sorry?
Are you a super psychic?
No.
Oh.
I have my psychic quality, if you want to use that term, relates to a certain area only.
Do you know which level of heaven you go to?
I'm sorry?
Do you know which level of heaven you go to?
Well, it depends on different experiences, but higher mental, lower Buddhic plane. Rarely the lower Buddhic plane. Only experienced that a couple of times. Mainly higher astral. So, physical plane, okay, or the what they call Annamaya Kosha in Sanskrit. So that the Annamaya Kosha is that when you have the physical body, lives by food on the physical plane. Then there's the astral plane, second. Then the mental plane is divided into the lower and the higher mental plane. Then there's the Buddhic plane.
Fifth level?
Okay, that would be, yes. And then the Atmic plane. Okay, so the Atmic plane is only for masters of wisdom. It's formless, it's pure energy. I've never experienced, I could only intellectualize. My teacher would never let us fantasize, oh, I'm on this, I'm this. Most people rarely go above the mental plane because it still has form, and we are form related. And when you visualize, say you do a meditation, you picture a Buddha or whatever you want to visualize, then you're creating, using your manas, part of your intellectual center aspect, and the higher part, using the Kriya Shakti to create a form in mental matter. So for instance, now I teach every week the teaching on the 5 Dhyani Buddhas, or the 5 celestial Buddhas, using higher archetypes of these particular Buddhas. For instance, Amitabha is the celestial Buddha of which Gautama, the historical Buddha, is an emanation. Okay? So if you meditate on these by creating the mandala, you use your will through your intellect to create these forms, building a divine thought form. By creating a divine thought form over time, it can create an alignment with the higher planes, and that way you can experience these different Buddhas. They can become alive. And they're sometimes called the Buddhas of transformation. They can transform your being. One of the weaknesses today in people, they're doing mindfulness or this or that, thinking that I can do it. I'm meditating. I'm stuck. There is no I. As the Buddha said, Anatman. You have to realize it takes a divine force through surrender, not surrendering in a limpid way, but surrendering in a way of strength and understanding. And that's what lifts you up. If you read the labors of Hercules as he's looking for the golden fleece, it's a symbol of esoteric knowledge. Before he's handed, not the golden fleece, the golden apples of the Hesperides, it's the apples. Before he's handed the apples of esoteric knowledge, he had to help Atlas, who was holding the world on his shoulders, to take the world, the troubles of the world, through surrendering and helping and serving, then he helped Atlas, and from that his service, then the maidens, I forget what they're called, appeared and handed him the sacred apples. It's through humility, but through knowledge, but also through service and recognizing the divinity within yourself and surrendering to that inner spark that you awaken. You can't force it. It can't be done with your I want. Initially, even the Master DK mentions that all of us on the spiritual path are selfish because I want to achieve this, I want to reach this. That's allowed, but as you reach deeper, that has to be put aside. As it says in the Voice of the Silence, humble one must be as they approach wisdom, humbler still when wisdom has been reached. It's always the way of humility. And that's giving a speech. That's not easy because I'm expressing all this story. But in my meditation, when one centers in their essence, one is feeling more in humility and surrender, and then the divine forces come down. Otherwise, they don't. Okay? But you have to know the way to do that. And the esoteric way is it has to be done verbally. The esoteric tradition is not online. You can get hints from books, so please buy my book, because there is a lot in there. But the old traditions, even though through what I learned, was all synthesized, and we learned a great deal, it's still passed from teacher to student. It's still a verbal transmission. And that's what the Buddha taught too, when he lifted up the rose and Mahakasyapa smiled. And then, the Buddha said, I now recognize that the right eye, or the truth, the Dharma, is passed. It's not the actual words to Mahakasyapa, still through a verbal. You can go to Tibetan empowerments. I've been to quite a few, and they chant and chant and chant, and basically you're sitting there and they say, you've been empowered, unless you recognize what's happened. But most of it, if you're not ready, it just passes over your head. But my teacher could initiate someone 5-6 minutes, because he could pass the energy and himself lift you on the higher plane for a few moments, so you had the initiation, chant the mantra, explain its meaning, then you come down and then you have to work your way up, but you're given the seed. And if you water it through effort, perseverance, study, sincerity, and humility, the seed will blossom forth until you yourself become, through lots of effort, an expression of that path itself. And that's the meaning that the aspirant has to become the disciple who is an expression, or is the path, through their effort, suffering, and work, and humility. And it hasn't changed over centuries. That's why now it's called the ageless wisdom. It's unchanged. What has changed is the way you can approach it. But in essence, the laws have not changed. And thus a lot of the New Age stuff that tries to change and find shortcuts doesn't really work. But I think you'd enjoy my book. I got an amazing review. Unfortunately, through all of Cyrus's trips and stuff, he can see that the future of spirituality is in group work like this. It's very nice. It's on my website.